Welcome to the Home of Medicine BITESIZE episode. This is where me and Ben discuss the day-to-day complexities of working in a very busy healthcare system. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. I was going to ask your opinion and your insights about something I've been thinking about recently in terms of medical education, because as we all know, medical education in the UK is based around a premise of getting feedback on what you do. And we've sort of formalized that a lot in terms of the portfolio requirements that trainees have to do. They have to get their feedback basically written down and evaluated and assessed. And I just noticed over the years that process is filled with all sorts of pitfalls. Not all consultants are great about filling these forms in, and they tend to be done with a big time delay. For example, I might work with a particular doctor on a Monday. On a Thursday following, I'll get what we call a ticket, an email saying, could you fill out a feedback form for me that we discussed this case together? And maybe I'll get around to it the following Monday. And I just wonder, is this valuable feedback? Does this go anywhere? And how many of the feedback's actually meaningful? I've supervised as a clinical and educational advisor enough doctors, and I've read enough of these sort of case-based discussions and all these sorts of things to see how many consultants are actually writing down, great job, points for improvement, nothing specific, or keep up the good work, actions as above. That is meaningless. And how does that actually inform anyone's professional development or ongoing, learning in a training post? So I've been thinking about how we can give meaningful feedback in a safe way to doctors who are actively seeking it, A, because they have to for their portfolio, but B, I think a lot of doctors want to know how well they did. And I think that is a loaded statement itself, because if they frame it as how well did I do on that case, you're basically asking me to give you a grade or to give you a sort of rating as you did pretty good, not so good, you did excellent. And I find that creates a slightly weird dynamic where they're trying to please or impress me. And therefore, the only cases they ever ask for feedback on are cases where they've done an amazing job and really, wowed me. And I think more interesting learning and more interesting feedback comes from cases that are challenging or tricky. And I'd love it if trainees say, can we do a feedback on this case that we saw, because I really struggled with this, or I really didn't know this, and that was a learning moment for me. I'd love to give that, but I don't get those invitations to do it, because we've in a weird place in medical education where the only feedback they kind of want is evaluation-based feedback where they get a good grade. Does that all kind of make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I'm thinking about really is I work with lots of different people every day when I'm on call, when I'm at work, and I'm seeing a patient, or they see a patient, or we're doing a post-take ward round, or I'm doing an observation. How do I give meaningful feedback on the moment? And is feedback on the moment meaningful, or should feedback be done always at a later date? So I guess it's about the timing of feedback as well is really important. Where do you give that feedback? What's the right situation? And I find it quite easy to give good feedback. Well done. Great. That was brilliant. Keep on the good work. I am very bad at giving bad feedback or not so good feedback, because it just sits a bit uncomfortable with me. Particularly, I think if you've observed behaviours or knowledge gaps or management of a case that isn't great, you need to address it there and then for the key points to get through. But I'm not sure how best to do that is. So I'm interested in what you've got to say.
That's really familiar to me. And by the way, I'm not just talking about consultants and other postgraduate doctors. I'm talking to SHOs who want to give feedback to an FY1 or registrars or anyone at any level, really, because we're all engaged in this process of trying to create the next generation of fantastic doctors. And I definitely know what you mean. I think a lot of people struggle and avoid giving negative feedback because it is psychologically and socially very uncomfortable to do. It's great that you're comfortable giving good feedback, because that's something we do not do well, I think, in the NHS. We don't tell people they've done a good job. We assume everyone's going to do a great job, and therefore we don't need to mention it when they do, which I don't agree with at all. And I do know that positive feedback, even if it's one line email, great job on Friday, by the way, is a really powerful motivator. And it works way, way more as a carrot than a stick to say, okay, here's where you went wrong. So my approach is, and there's different types of models of giving feedback. I agree with you that feedback should be contemporaneous, i.e., at the time when something happens. It should be private. You shouldn't be having it as a group conversation, and it should be specific. I really urge you will never give feedback like you're just not doing as well as we'd expect in a moment like this, because that's useless. What is someone supposed to do with that apart from feel depressed? So give very, very specific examples. And if you want them to improve, give them one thing to improve on. Don't say, here's 5 things you've got to do better next time. That's not right. It's not going to be able to be assimilated and to actually result in a meaningful change in behavior. I know for years we've used a feedback model called the feedback sandwich or the critique sandwich. It has other names, which is basically, here's one thing you did well, here's one thing that you didn't do well, and finally, here's a positive point just as a palate cleanser at the end. And I don't think that's authentic. I think people are wise to that, and it sounds artificial when people hear it. When they hear that here's something you did well part, they sort of think, uh-oh, here comes the big critique. So I've moved away from that recently. There's another feedback model that maybe people have identified with. It's got a really weird name. It's called advocacy with inquiry, which sounds very fancy, but it basically means you notice something and you ask a question, and it sounds a bit like this. I noticed that you did this for this patient. What was it that made you do that? I noticed that you didn't ask about this in this history. So what was it that did that? And that's basically very open. It does work with some people who have got good reflection, but for me, I found it missed a button, it missed an end point, it missed a specific goal about what are we going to do differently next time. So the model that I use and what I want to talk to you about is called plus delta. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I have to say, plus delta.
Yeah, it's 2 symbols,
No.
plus like positive sign, plus, and delta,
Ooh,
which is
and the delta.
triangle. Yeah, so it's a plus delta.
Oh,
Plus stands for positive. Delta, as we know, because we did A-level chemistry, stands for change. So
H.
basically, it's a way of remembering and saying there's something that you liked and then something that you could do differently next time. And I find it's actually a very authentic way of giving feedback, and it's very short, and it also is specific. So if someone's, let's say someone's done a case and I think they missed something out, or I think that maybe they didn't do what I would have done in that situation, I normally frame it as, I'm very happy to give you feedback on this case. In this particular case, I really liked how you did X, actually. That was really good. And there's something to say for that. And then I move on and say, I'll tell you something that you could do though differently next time. You could try this because that really worked for me. Or next time, let me give you a little tip. Try this. That's actually something that will work for you better. And that's it. That's all it is. And then they know for next time. And it tends to be quite satisfying for both giver and receiver of feedback. And it also ends with one actionable point and 10, in my experience, not to leave a sour taste in anyone's mouth. So it might look like, sure, I'll give you feedback about how you manage this tachyarrhythmia and resus. I really like how you're really fast in getting the resus trolley over and getting the adenosine out. That was great. Here's my little tip though. Next time you do this, make sure you tell the patient that's going to feel really weird when the adenosine goes in, because that can be quite scary otherwise. Will you do that for me next time? Fantastic. And then at the end, I say, do you know what we've just done? We've just done a case-based discussion. Why don't you send me a ticket for that? And I'll fill it out for you. And then they've got it formalized, which is a mandatory requirement for them. We've got a really good what went well, what we're going to do differently next time. So I can fill that in and it's authentic. It's no nonsense like keep up the good work. And they've actually got a meaningful contemporaneous feedback. What do you think?
So I really like it. I think it's hopefully something that I do a little bit of it anyway, maybe, but not realizing that it had a sort of a frame to it. That was really good. Although to be fair, I'm not so good at doing that. This is what you could do better next time. Yeah, I'm going to go away and I'm going to try that and I think the key thing, what you really said as well, is it's busy. You're in ED, for example, you may be dealing with this tachyarrhythmia. You can't list 10 positive points. You can't list 10 negative points and 10 things to change. You have to do one takeaway or two takeaway things that we can change because that's what we're going to remember in that setting. And certainly I can imagine after a long day on call, the doctor who you've been working with in training or the consultant you've been working with and had that discussion with is going to remember, oh yeah. And I remember when Dr. Lovell said to me, was really happy with how I managed that SVT and how quick I got the adenosine out. But I must remember next time to speak to the patient.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's really nice, calm way of doing it, and it's on the moment, because I find I remember stuff better when I relate to a patient.
Yeah.
So I will then remember that feedback for the 25-year-old gentleman who was in resus on a Monday morning. I always then attribute that feedback to that particular case, and that can be really helpful. So I really like that way.
It's all yours. I didn't make it up, but I like to pass it around. So there you go. Make it specific. Here's one thing I like. Let me give you a tip for next time you do it, though. And I think it comes across respectful, and I think it's quite powerful.
Absolutely. So when you then talk about the takeaway point, then, so you said, next time, I maybe want you to, get the adenosine out quicker, or, inform the patient. So moving forward, how do you close the conversation, the feedback conversation?
I ask them if that sounds reasonable, because I might say to them, next time, let me give you a tip. Could you try this? And they might say, no, I deliberately don't do that because and they have a really good reason for it. Or I give them a chance to answer. So it's not just me burbling at them, it's more of a conversation. And they'll say, oh, okay, that's fair enough. Next time I'll do that. And then we've closed. I say, brilliant. So next time you're going to do that. Great job. And we're done. And it roughly takes about 2 minutes to do so. So yeah, make it specific, make it a two-way conversation, make sure they agree with you that it's reasonable. And if so, it's a really useful nugget that means that we are actually having educational conversations in a feedback form with doctors who need it.
I think that's fantastic. And the busier that we get, the more stretched that we get, what often falls by the wayside is those educational conversations, because we're very conscious of, I've got to go and see the next patient, I've got to go and do this. But actually, by doing your model, it actually doesn't take very much time.
Not at all.
So I've got no excuse for not having that conversation, to be honest. So I'm gonna do it with everybody now. Everyone's gonna be fed of me.
Let's all try it tomorrow. We'll all do it at least once tomorrow. Deal?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good way of trialing it. And I think hopefully then, by role modeling that really positive type of giving feedback, not necessarily always positive feedback, but a nice sort of I'm trying to think of, what's the word I'm thinking of? It's a passionate way of, it's considerate, that was the word, yeah, a considerate way of giving feedback. But hopefully that our trainees and our doctors and all the healthcare professionals who are working with us will start to role model that as well. So it passes it down. It's easy. Yeah, paying it forward.
That's how you change culture. That's how you change workplace culture, I think. Little bits.
Yeah, And I always think I'm never going to change culture, on a big scale. But if you can do tiny little bits that, affect those few people around you, then it builds outwards, doesn't it? And then all of a sudden there might be a bigger change that actually, grew from a tiny little seed. So fantastic. Great. So some really good points are on feedback. Thank you to everybody out there who's listened to our Home of Medicine Bite Size. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Home of Medicine podcast, a podcast brought to you by the EFIM Academy in association with the European Federation of Internal Medicine, a leading organisation in internal medicine. Thanks for listening.